Night of October 24, into the early hours of October 25, 1944. Surigao Strait, Mindanao, Sea, Philippines. Night presses close and warm. The tide runs like a slow breath between the islands. Wooden hulls idle in the troughs with engines ticking low. A patrol torpedo crew stands to stations. A young ensign wipes salt from his eyes and leans into the binoculars. He hears the hiss of spray against the bow. He hears the short clatter of a feed tray as a gunner checks a .50 caliber one more time. A faint white pulse climbs and dies on the northern horizon. Another follows. Star shells. The strait answers with a distant rolling thunder. PT boat squadrons are strung across the narrows in small packs. 2 boats here, 3 boats there. Each section waits in the lee of a point or behind a line of shoals. The plan is simple. Shadow. Close. Fire. Break away at full throttle. Report. Do it again. The boats are 80 feet of speed and nerve built of wood and layered paint. Each carries torpedoes in roll-off racks. Each mounts a 20mm forward and a 40mm amidships with .50 caliber machine guns on the beam. There is no armor. There is only darkness, spray, and timing. PT boat sections screen the narrows. Destroyer divisions form up astern Oldendorf's battle line, bars the northern exit of Surigao Strait. Destroyer divisions will make their own night torpedo runs before the battle line opens. To the south, radar scopes whisper new blips. A column slides north along the channel. The picture hardens as flares bloom and fade. The Japanese Southern Force under Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura is coming in line ahead. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers. The wakes draw pale lines on black water. The small boats turn to meet the line from a beam. They run low and fast engines rising to a taut metallic snarl. The helmsman holds a shallow weave to spoil a plot without bleeding speed. The coxswain calls bearing and range in a steady voice that does not match his pulse. The first searchlight snaps on. A white blade scythes the night and arrests on spray. The water around the boat erupts in neat rows that march closer in a heartbeat. The helmsman kicks the rudders. The bow carves through a seam of shadow. The gun crew answers with short, hard bursts, walking tracers up the beam to blind the light. The torpedo crewman palms a gyro and calls ready. The ensign lets the seconds stack in his head. He feels the stern climb on a swell. He breathes. He calls fire. The tube coughs and the weapon slides into black water with a hiss and a fading wake. The boat knifes out of the cone and vanishes behind smoke that drifts low and stubborn on the surface. Far to the north, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf sets his ships across the northern exit of the strait. Heavy guns are ready. Fire control teams are quiet over their boards. The last battleship crossfire of the war will belong to the big ships. The dread that grows in these narrows begins here, where wooden hulls cross in the dark and human voices speak ranges by feel, and where a hand on a throttle can tip a fate by a single heartbeat. Spray drifts back over the cockpit and tastes of oil. The coxswain leans on the throttles and holds the weave. Bearings change, ranges change. The column does not move like a single will anymore. A cruiser veers to avoid a pale wake that might be a torpedo track or might be moonlight trapped in swell. A destroyer lurches to cover the gap and throws a searchlight that knifes the smoke at the wrong angle. Voices rise on enemy decks and fade under the next shell burst. The small boat rides the shadow line along a reef and feels the water lift and slacken in a steady pulse. The helmsman steals a glance at the chart light and shuts it with 2 fingers. He trusts the sounder and the smell of the wind on his cheek. The radio man works a key with careful economy. Short reports, bearings, target counts, estimated speeds. The net comes alive with other hands, tapping the same facts in other pockets of black water. A shore station repeats and relays up the chain to the waiting line. A picture builds that no single eye can hold. The sense of a cage closing. The sense that the night no longer belongs to the intruder. A lookout whispers contact ahead to starboard. A squat, dark hull slides across the bow on a slow crossing course. Not a warship, a workboat or tug or barge strung astern. The ensign holds his breath. He lets the barges pass untouched, because the column is the real threat, and seconds are a currency that cannot be spent twice. Far to the north, heavy ships whisper to one another in low voices. Range tables, deflection, sequenced illumination. Men move through red light and cool silence. They wait for the moment when geometry becomes fire. The small boats give them that moment, by peeling away the certainty of the enemy plot, by forcing turns that will look harmless on a dead reckoning trace, and will become fatal when the big guns speak. Engines thrum through wooden frames like a living heartbeat. The crew feels it in their knees and shoulders. The ensign finds himself counting it without meaning to. He realizes the boat is counting him too. A new flare blooms over the central channel. It hangs like a cruel sun and turns the water to hammered metal. The section leader calls for a second run. The coxswain nods once and brings the bow up into the light. The gunner rides the sight and waits for the next sweep of the beam. The torpedo crewman checks the latch and strokes the housing with the back of his hand. The boat tips into a trough and climbs out nose-high spray hissing away to either side. The searchlight falls on them again. The gunner answers with a short burst. The white circle blinks and flares and blinks again. The helmsman holds steady for one breath longer than comfort. Fire. The boat kicks. The wake breaks into a ragged brightness of churn and torn phosphor. Somewhere ahead, metal hits water with a sound like a deep bell. There is no way to know if a weapon found a hull or if a shell found the sea. The crew does not wait to learn. The coxswain hauls the wheel over and drives for the darkness behind a headland where mangroves throw a deep shade. The engine note drops to a patient growl. The radio man sends again. The reply is a single acknowledgement and an instruction to clear the channel for a destroyer division that is already moving into position. The small boat yields the killing ground and slides along the edge, still watching, still ready to cut back in if the picture needs another nudge. The night shifts. The thunder that follows is not the light, quick hammer of destroyer guns. It is the long, rolling concussion of heavy batteries firing in sequence from a line that stretches across the exit like a door barred from hinge to hinge. The sea carries the sound down the strait and into the ribs of every wooden hull that has worked this water for hours. The men on the small boats do not cheer. They listen. They mark the rhythm. They measure the space between salvo and splash. They feel the column begin to die without ever seeing the faces on those bridges, or the shock that runs through men who expected a dark passage and found a trap built of patient hands and small wakes. Dawn will show oil and wreckage and the marks of turning circles that did not close. The patrol torpedo crews will look at their boats and count the fresh splinters and the empty cradles and the soot that has settled on every flat surface. They will sleep in odd places with life jackets for pillows. Then they will rise at the next sunset and do it again in another narrows, because this is how the enemy moves now, by night, by small craft, by barge and tug and luck. The fear that grows in the coastal lanes began long before this strait and will spread after it. It begins when a silent shore blinks once and wood and engines come alive in the dark, where a chart shows nothing but water and wind. Smoke drifts in slow sheets over the water and holds the smell of burned paint and hot cordite. The patrol torpedo boat slides along the dark edge of the headland with engines just above idle. Men breathe through cloth to cut the sting. The radio man copies a fragment from a destroyer division that has run in and turned away, then another that speaks of targets burning in the central channel. The coxswain answers with a single acknowledgement and keeps the bow toward open water. The helmsman watches the line where mangrove shadow yields to faint sky and reads the small shifts of tide by the way ripples lean against a root. The sea begins to show texture as the eastern rim pales. Swells carry a low ash shine. Wreckage rises into sight by degrees, first as shapes without context, then as lines that you can name. A mast, a raft, a field of floating timber that does not belong to any one ship, because it belongs to all ships that fight and break in confined water. A boat hook finds a box of signal flares. A hand finds an oil slick that paints the palm black. The crew looks out across the strait and sees the long scars that turning circles left when orders were given in fear and revised too late. The section leader brings the boats together under the lee of a point where the wind is steady and the water is flat enough for a quick check. Fuel is counted. Ammunition is counted. The gunner cleans fouling from the throat of a barrel and runs a rag through the sight ring. The torpedo crewman checks safety wires on the empty cradles with the same care he would give a live round because ritual steadies the hands. A machinist lays his ear against a bearing housing and listens for a scrape. He hears only the clean hum of reduction gears cooling in the light air. Men sit back on their heels and let joints remember stillness. A launch from a larger ship noses in with a message and a crate that smells of coffee and paraffin. The paper carries the plain words that mean everything and nothing. Maintain patrols along the southern approaches. Interdict small craft moving by night. Report barge concentrations with bearings and counts. The mission is the same, only the chart changes. The boats will move again at last light and write a new set of thin white lines along reach and channel and reef. The crews make those lines by instinct now. The shape of a likely ambush point is in the body before it is on the map. By mid-morning the heat is blunt and unavoidable. The boats settle into their hides and wait through the long glare. Men sleep under awnings. A hand keeps watch with a pair of binoculars that are older than the man who holds them. An engine cover is lifted a fraction to let air move. A jotting pad collects bearings for a coast where every point has a name and every name has a memory burned into it by spray and gunfire. The day crawls. The afternoon breathes. The light begins to thin again. The sea that was hammered steel at noon becomes blue glass with a skin of catspaw ripples that move shoreward in delicate fans. When the sun touches the ridgeline to the west, the boats come alive in a quiet that feels like reverence. Engines turn, radios warm, guns are checked by touch rather than talk. The section eases out from the mangrove line and takes up its stations along the channel that a barge train must choose if it hopes to make miles before dawn. The plan is modest. Let the first hulls pass. Hit the centre. Break the tow lines if possible. Rake the decks with short bursts and make the coxswains choose between the reef and the open reach, where other boats wait with engines spooled and sights set to a range that will feel unfair at the instant of first fire. Darkness returns with speed once the sun is gone. Stars show between thin cloud. The sound of water against wood is the only constant. Then another sound enters the ear from far down the channel. A diesel at steady throttle. Another joins it. A third follows and sets up a beat that tells you more than any light could tell. Hull count, load weight, speed held by a cautious hand. The boats let the train draw near until the smell of wet rice and canvas is as clear as the smell of salt and oil. The coxswain gives one small nod. The helmsman answers with a turn that lays the bow along the lead tow line at a shallow angle. The first bursts are brief and exact. A line of sparks runs across a drum on the barge deck and leaps to a coil of rope that vanishes in white smoke. Men shout in a language that carries perfectly across water. A tug throws its throttle forward in a reflex that pulls slack and then finds nothing to pull. The train comes apart in a slow motion that looks gentle until the current takes hold and begins to drift heavy hulls toward the reef. The patrol torpedo boats do not linger in the cone of return fire. Each breaks clean, turns through its own smoke and sets up for a second cut that will finish what the first began. The fear that had a name in the strait now has a shape along this coast. It is wood and speed and sudden light where there was only night a breath before. Lines of sparks fade and leave only the soft red of banked fire on a drifting deck. The tide takes hold of the broken train and pulls it toward the teeth of the reef with a patience that no engine can match. A tug turns broadside to bring a gun to bear and shows its ribs to the night for a single fatal breath. Short bursts walk across the wheelhouse windows and step down the flank to the waterline. The propeller thrashes foam and then stops. The hull settles. The darkness closes again as if it had never opened. Silence after contact is its own kind of noise. Ears ring with absence. The crews hold their breath for the count of 10 and then breathe out together as if a signal had passed between them. Engines fall to a stalker idle. The section spreads back into the channels that lace the flats. One boat drifts with engines off to listen for the slow beat of another tow. Another slides along the reef edge to watch for men in the water and to mark their drift with a pencil and a small light tucked under a palm to hide the glow. It is not mercy alone, it is also information. Where they drift tells where the current goes under this moon, and that tells where the next ambush will close. The radio whispers with other reports from other cuts along the coast. barge concentrations sighted at bearings that match the earlier pattern, a note of return fire from a cove that seemed empty at dusk, a brief mention of a grounded hull still burning and lighting a reach that will not be safe for an hour. The section leader makes a small change. Hold the southern fork, give the northern fork back to the dark, and take the middle path that bends twice around a sandbar like a knuckle. The helmsman nods, even though no one can see him. His hands know the turn before the order finishes, because the chart has already been traced into muscle and breath. Cloud moves in from the west and dims the stars. The water takes on a deeper tone. A ripple of diesel carries again from far down the channel. Slower this time. Heavier. The approach has learned caution. The patrol torpedo boats wait a little longer and let the train draw almost a beam before they move. The first boat slides into the gap and raises a wave that makes the tow line sing like a wire. A second crosses at an angle that forces the tug to choose between keeping the tow and keeping steerage. The choice takes 1 second. The outcome lasts for miles. Lines part, loads swing. Deck cargo spills with a drum roll of crates thumping into water. Voices pile on top of one another in a rush that becomes a single pleading tone in a language every sailor knows. Return fire comes harsh and ragged from a gun shield that shows as a darker shape against dark. Splinters walk the spray across the cockpit combing. Men crouch by habit and still do their work. The gunner counts bursts to keep barrels cool. The radio man taps bearings with one finger to stay steady while the hull pounds. The machinist keeps a hand on the throttle cable where it passes under the deck grating so he can feel the metal change temperature. The coxswain watches for the muzzle flash that will show the angle of the enemy gun and turns a heartbeat before the next shot, stealing aim away by the width of a hand. A glow blooms briefly on the horizon to the north where the strait opens toward the sea. There is no sound at first. Then the air carries a deep pulse that rolls over the water in 3 long strokes. The heavy ships are still at work. Their reach extends into this night even when their guns are quiet. A barge master hears that far thunder and thinks of what waits beyond the next point. He pulls his throttle back and chooses the shallow water route to hug the land. It is the right choice for daylight. It is the wrong choice for now. The patrol torpedo boats have eyes along that line and have cut narrow lanes between sand fingers that only a wooden hull dares to use at speed. The lead patrol torpedo boat lifts its bow and runs the slot with a confidence earned in 100 rehearsals. The engine note climbs and holds. The helm moves in small exact easings that lay the wake along the curve of the bank without breaking onto the sand. The second boat waits for the first to clear the choke and then follows on the clean water the wake leaves. The third stands off to rake the channel with short bracketing bursts that mark the space where any enemy gunner must pass if he hopes to fire. The trap is geometry and memory. It closes without a shout. When it is done, the sea takes back its sounds. The slow slap of wave against mangrove roots, the tick of cooling metal, the faint hiss of a flare guttering out on a wet plank. The section regroups in the lee and counts fuel by the glare of a hooded light. Ammunition is low but not empty. Engines are warm but not failing. Nerves show in small motions. A hand that keeps folding and unfolding a rag, a jaw that works once like a man chewing. Men look outward again, and the small boat turns its bow into the faint push of the tide. There is time for one more cut before dawn. The diesel beat comes again thinner now, like a voice that does not believe itself. The coxswain looks at the helmsman. The helmsman answers with the slightest angle of the wheel and the bow slides toward the sound. The night opens and closes in front of the boat like a curtain that breathes. The work continues because the lane remains open until someone closes it. The fear that moves along this coast rides on rumour and on memory and on the undeniable math of lost miles. Each barge that turns back is a ration that does not reach a beach. Each tug that fails to clear a point is a loss that echoes for weeks in the mouths of men who wait for rice and ammunition and never see either. The last cut begins with nothing more than a shadow thickening against the darker line of shore. The helm eases a handspan. The bow slides into the gap between 2 sand fingers that a survey would call impassable at speed. The patrol torpedo boat rides the narrow pressure ridge that runs along the bank. The engine note sharpens. The gunner sets his elbows and keeps his breath level. The radio man touches the key and lets it rest. The coxswain waits for the sound of the tow to show its weight. It comes as a heavy, patient thrum that seems to rise through the soles of the feet. A tug noses around the bend with a barge train strung astern like a chain of dark houses. The wake draws a faint silver line in the slack water. The patrol torpedo boat holds for one more heartbeat. Then it moves. A short burst takes the pilot house windows into blind glass rain. Another burst walks across the tow line that hums like a wire and then parts with a dull sound that can be felt more than heard. The barge behind slews wide, the next swings to avoid it, the next rides up on the edge and slides back with a groan. The train turns into a loose flock and loses the one thing that kept it safe, which was direction. Return fire clatters from the stern of the tug. The rounds stitch spray across the bow and chew a seam along the coaming. The helmsman dips the shoulder of the hull into a trough and throws a near miss wide. The gunner answers with two short brackets that pin the enemy barrel to an angle where it will always be a breath late. The second patrol torpedo boat cuts in from the far side and rakes the deck of the lead barge to drive men to ground. The third stays back and lays thin smoke that folds into the mangrove shade. The smell of burned paint adds a new sting to the old mix of salt and oil and wet wood. The sea holds its breath for a moment after the last burst. Then it exhales. Drifting hulls knock softly together. A crate bumps the bow and spins away. The coxswain throttles back. The section slides out of the cone of return fire and uses the curve of the bank like a shield. Engines fall to a cautious idle. Men check one another by touch. A hand runs down a forearm to feel for a nick. A palm rests for a second on a shoulder and moves on. The machinist leans over the engine hatch and listens. The note is clean. The heat is high but not dangerous. The boat is sound. Dawn lifts first as a suggestion, then as a dull strip beyond the mangroves, then as a flat grey that paints every shape with a thin edge. The channel shows the work of the night in lines and stains. Oil feathers out from a grounded hull and runs with the tide in a rainbow skin. A broken spar lies like a pencil across a sandbar. Men on the wrecks move with careful, measured motions that belong more to fatigue than to fear. The patrol torpedo boats keep their distance. They are hunters, not collectors. They mark positions. They note drifts. They pass the grid to a patrol that will come later with different orders. The section leader finds clean water under a limestone bluff and brings the boats in tight. Fuel is low. Ammunition is lower. The list on the back of a chart shows every round that left a barrel and every gallon that left a tank. A launch from a larger ship noses in with cans and canvas bags and a folded paper. The words are brief and exact. Maintain pressure along the coastal lanes. Strike at night. Avoid day gunnery except in self-defense. Report concentrations by count and bearing. The mission that began in the strait now threads every inlet where a barge can hide for an hour and move for a mile. Heat sits on the decks by mid-morning like a weight. Men sleep in slices and wake at the shift of shade. A hand wipes the salt from a sight ring with a rag that used to be white. Another hand rewraps a cable where it rubs against a bolt head. The radio man dries the key plates with a pinch of tissue from a waterproof tin. These are small motions that keep a boat alive. The hours stretch. The mind wants a sound to break them. The sea gives none. The sea saves the sounds for night. The light falls again. The mangroves go from green to black. The first breeze moves across the flats and lays a fine pattern that shows the current lines like threads. The boats move out with a hush that has nothing to do with silence and everything to do with intent. Stations are taken. Angles are set. The plan is spare. Let the lead pass. Cut the middle. Drive the tail where the reef eats time. If the enemy has learned the lessons of last night, then the lesson will be applied to a new set of turns and a new pattern of sand. Darkness closes. The diesel beat returns from far away, more careful than before, more broken in tempo. The patrol torpedo boats do not rush. They let the approach right itself on the water. They move only when the pen lifts. The first cut goes through clean and leaves two barges drifting with their loads still aboard and their purpose taken away. The second cut is messier, the tug braver, the return fire hotter by a degree. The third cut is the one that matters because it lands exactly where the current pulls hardest. The train comes apart. The reef waits without hurry. Miles are lost that will never be regained. The fear along this coast grows in increments. It is not a roar. It is a set of pauses. A tug slows a fraction at a bend where it once ran full. A bargemaster leaves 2 crates on the beach rather than risk the last stretch. A schedule that began as a promise becomes a guess. The patrol torpedo boats do not see the faces of the men who feel that change. They see the wakes. They read the time. They count the crates that do not move. That is enough. The work will go on until the lanes are quiet, or until a new order comes that points them to the next strait, the next bend, the next night, where wood and speed and nerve are the only tools that matter. Afternoon brings a courier with thin sheets that smell of fresh ink and damp canvas, reports from coast watchers, fragments from intercepted traffic, notes from a submarine that counted barges at the mouth of a river to the south 2 nights ago. The pages sketch a rhythm more than a route. Loads move after moonrise. Tugs pause in coves that face west to mask their smoke against the night breeze. Convoys split at a limestone headland where the current forks and rejoin, 3 miles later, under a cliff marked by a single dead tree. The boats study the marks as if they were faces. Engines cool under awnings that flap in the tide breeze. A machinist with blackened hands sits cross-legged and cleans the fine grit out of a carburetor bowl with a strip of cloth. A gunner relevels a sight that took a hard jar when a crate struck the mount at speed. The radio man dries a coil with patient breath and tests the key with a single light tap that sounds like a raindrop in a cave. The coxswain sleeps in a position that looks impossible and wakes in an instant at the scrape of a cleat against a plank. The helmsman stares at the chart until the channels rise from flat ink into a living map inside his chest. Light angles low and turns the mangrove leaves to coins. The boats slip out as the first bats trade places with the last swallows. There is no speech beyond the words that matter. Bearing, range, speed, wait, go. A line of cloud to the west promises darkness without rain. The water holds a slow, even set toward the reef. The section takes the middle fork, where a cautious tugmaster will go if he has learned anything from last night. The first watch breathes shallow and listens for the faint braided sound that means heavy tow on a short line. The night forms up out of separate shades. A low throb begins so far away that it could be a memory at first. It grows into a statement and then into a presence. The patrol torpedo boats take their positions along the curve of the channel, with the ease of men moving through a familiar room in the dark. The lead patrol torpedo boat edges outward until the bow kisses the faint seam where slack water meets the channel flow. The second settles on a parallel line that will carry it in just behind the lead barge. The third hangs back where a cross-channel will let it cut the tail if the train tries to turn. A small picket craft noses ahead of the convoy, a single gun shield and a single lamp hooded to a slit. It is a new caution, and it is not enough. The wake shows too clearly under the lamp. The lead patrol torpedo boat slides across that wake and throws a sheet of spray that blanks the lamp for one breath. The gunner uses that breath to stitch the shield with a short pattern that knocks the barrel down and leaves the sea to take over the rest. The convoy keeps its throttle because orders say to keep throttle, and a habit that saves you in daylight ruins you here. Tug and barges fill the channel like a black wall that moves on 8 hearts. The patrol torpedo boats do not try to break the wall with one blow. They cut at the joints, a burst at a tow point, a burst at a wheelhouse window, a burst that runs the length of a deck and drives men down so that hands that should be on lines and levers are clamped over ears. The first barge slews and touches the bank with a dull wooden moan. The second rides up on its wash and slides off again in a way that steals all its momentum. The third loses its line and drifts crosswise with a stubborn grace that blocks the rest. Return fire finds the air rather than the hull. Tracers carve straight lines that the boats answer with curves. The helmsman moves the wheel 2 fingers at a time and places the boat in the narrow water that opens and closes around it like a lung. The engine note climbs and holds steady at a number that every man aboard knows by feel. The radio key ticks once to mark a bearing and twice to mark a count. The message travels outward along paths that have been used so often that they exist even when radios are silent. Patrols shift. Nets tighten. A coast that looked empty at dusk now has a pattern of presence in every cut. A flare goes up from the convoy and hangs at a height that seems to belong to another world. The light washes the mangroves into flat paper shapes with hard edges. The patrol torpedo boats erase themselves by motion. Speed makes its own darkness. The gunner waits for the interval between glare and uses it to step, bursts up a tug flank until glass and wood and will all fail together. The smoke that rises is heavy and close. It bends under the first breath of the sea breeze and folds back over the channel like a lid. Silence returns faster than sense. The section pulls away by pre-arranged angles and regroups under a limestone overhang where sound dies quickly. Men count ammunition in low voices. The list is short but workable. Fuel is sufficient for one more run. The coxswain looks at the helmsman and tilts his head toward the outer fork that seemed empty when the night began. The helmsman nods. They both know that a cautious enemy will try the path that felt safe at dusk even after the center has been cut. The patrol torpedo boats turn their bows into water that has not yet been written on tonight. The new channel smells of mud and crushed leaf. The tide sets in against the bow with a firmer push. The diesel throb comes again, this time from closer to the open reach beyond the point. The convoy has tried to slip through on the far edge of the pattern. The lead patrol torpedo boat takes the long curve, fast and low. The second holds back a length to keep the water clean and the sight lines open. The third watches the rear and counts seconds, so that all three strikes will land inside a window that a human mind reads as one event. The timing holds. The cut lands. The wake writes a truth that will be told with quiet voices at many small tables, far from here. The coastal lane is no longer a lane. It is a test that most will fail. The campaign settles into a memory that is made of nights and narrow water. Charts from those months carry pencil scars where ambushes closed and where trains broke and where men vanished into mangrove shade. Reports speak in small numbers that add up when you read them in a single sitting. Barges turned back. Loads delayed by one tide and then by another. Fuel drums that never leave a beach. Rice that sours before it moves inland. A coast that once pulsed with small craft begins to breathe shallow. The change is not sudden. It creeps. It hardens. It becomes the way things are. On larger maps, the war bends for many reasons. Airfields move forward by long jumps. Submarines knife the open lanes. Armies take islands that command whole seas. Inside that larger bend runs this thin thread of work. Patrol torpedo boats that turn night into a tool. Crews who know the smell of a cut before a compass can show it. Wooden hulls that take a pounding and still answer to a touch. The effect is local and relentless. It denies the enemy the comfort of routine. It turns resupply from a schedule into a wager that grows worse with each mile made and with each mile lost. Men on the other side learn to listen to water. They stand at a wheel and feel the small lift that means a sand finger waits where the channel narrows. They hold their breath at a bend where a pale wake once appeared out of nothing and tore a tow line into white strands. They push into the dark because orders say that they must, and because hungry men inland have faces that will not let them sleep if they turn back. They look for a safe lane and find only choices between risk and delay. They send messages that grow shorter as the nights grow longer. Arrival uncertain. Fuel low. Will attempt at moonset. Silence after that. For the small boat crews, the legacy is written in hands and in hearing. A machinist can tell the health of a bearing by the way the deck sings under his palm. A helmsman can run a blind cut by smell and by the weight of the wheel through the swing. A gunner can count rounds by the heat on his cheek. They carry those skills into other waters and into other years. They will look at a river far from war and know which fork runs deeper by the tilt of a reed. They will watch a fishing boat, choose a line, and know when the tide will turn by the way the wake closes. The war will leave them with a map that does not fade. On paper, the squadrons stand down in orderly lines. Boats are paid off, engines are sold, hulls go to other hands or to fire. Names remain in logs that smell of oil and salt and mildew. The men go home by slow ships and fast ships and by aircraft that cross ocean in a day where ocean once took weeks. They try to sleep in rooms that do not move. They wake at the sound of wind in trees and reach for a wheel that is not there. Time pulls them ashore by degrees. The sea still lives at the edge of hearing. The coastlines that knew the fear recover in their own measured ways. Fishers return to coves that once held gun smoke under the mangrove. Children learn to read the channels with the careful pride of their elders. The wrecks sink by inches and grow soft backs of coral and weed. Storms move them a little each year. A spar shows at a very low tide like the finger of a clock that keeps a different time. A story is told at a table about a night when the water lit white without warning and a wooden bow cut by like a knife. The teller laughs a little and then grows quiet. The lessons that last are practical and cold. Speed without a plan is a noise. Stealth without a purpose is a pause. A map is good. A rhythm is better. Strike where time is brittle. Make the enemy spend attention faster than he can spend fuel. Do it again the next night. The work is not heroic in the way that statues are heroic. It is human in the way that hands-on tools are human. It is patient. It respects detail. It carries risk without ceremony. One dawn finds the sea flat and pale and wide as a held breath. The patrol torpedo boats that worked this coast are gone. The lane lies empty. Mangroves hold their black line. Far out, where the reef breaks the swell into white lace, a single board rides high on trapped air and then settles. The sound is small and exact. The tide takes it and the next and the next. Wind comes off the land. A heron lifts. The day begins.